There is a version of Christian Coleman the world never fully saw. Not the starts, not the explosive acceleration out of the blocks that coaches pointed to as the most technically precise in a generation. Not the world record in the 60 metres that sat in the record books as evidence of what his body was capable of producing when everything the preparation had built arrived at the same moment. There is a version that existed in the quiet before races, in the 18 months when competition was taken from him before he had finished proving what he was, in the training sessions where the body was asked to maintain what the suspension had interrupted and the sport had moved past in his absence. At 30, far enough from the worst of it and close enough to the unfinished arguments, Coleman named 5 runners who made that version of him necessary. Every world title he collected, every 60-metre final he controlled, every finish line he crossed with the specific authority of a man who had decided that the years the ban had taken were a debt the sport owed him rather than a verdict on what he was. All of it was shaped by the men who forced him to become more than the circumstances had tried to reduce him to. At 30, he finally said their names. 5 runners, 5 different versions of the same hatred, 5 men he genuinely could not stand to race. Number 5, Justin Gatlin. The man who stood on the podium in 2017 where Coleman had already decided his own name belonged. Justin Gatlin won the 2017 World Championship 100-metre gold in London at 35 years old. He crossed the line in 9.92 seconds in the race that was supposed to belong to Usain Bolt. Bolt's farewell, the final chapter of an era, the last occasion the sport would gather around his name and allow the occasion itself to carry the weight of what was ending. Gatlin disrupted that, won the gold, and, in doing so, left a specific mark on the result that the young Christian Coleman, finishing second in 9.94 seconds in his first senior world championship final, was forced to carry forward as the context for his own introduction to the sport. Coleman had arrived in London as a 21-year-old college graduate, whose times had already placed him in conversations about the future of the event. He had run 9.82 seconds at the NCAA Championships that year, the 4th fastest time ever by an American at that point. The sprint world was already beginning to attach his name to the post-Bolt era, and then London produced a final that placed him second behind a man 2 generations his senior, who had already served a 4-year doping ban and built a career on the specific refusal to accept that the sport's judgment of him was the final word. What Gatlin gave Coleman was not the hatred of a rival who had beaten him cleanly in a race between equals. It was something more complicated, the hatred of a result that required the sport to explain itself on the biggest stage it possessed, of standing on a podium beside a man whose presence there required a conversation that Coleman had not signed up to be part of, and of understanding, at 21 years old, that the introduction to major championship sprinting, the career had been building toward, was going to be defined not simply by the time on the clock, but by who had finished 1 place ahead of him and why. Gatlin gave him the hatred of a context he did not choose, and the podium photograph from London carried that context into the historical record whether Coleman accepted it or not. Number 4. Trayvon Bromell. The rival who inherited the throne during the suspension and made coming back feel like arriving at a party that had already ended. Trayvon Bromell ran 9.7 seconds in 2021, the fastest time in the world that year. He won the US Olympic trials. He was identified, publicly and without ambiguity, as the successor to Usain Bolt's crown, as the man who would carry the 100-metre gold in Tokyo and give Americans sprinting a name to build the next era around. Coleman was watching from suspension. He had won the 2019 World Championship in Doha in 9.76 seconds, a personal best, a title, the confirmation that every time the sport had attached his name to the future of the event, it had been making an accurate prediction rather than projecting ambition onto potential. And then the whereabouts failures accumulated, the suspension arrived, and the 18 months that followed were 18 months in which the sport conducted its most significant conversations without him. Bromell's 2021 season was the clearest expression of what that absence had cost. Not just in the races that happened without Coleman, in the narrative that reformed around a new name, the successor to Bolt's story, the fastest man in the world story, the story the sport uses to identify who the present moment belongs to. All of it reformatted itself around Bromell, while Coleman was serving the final months of a ban for tests he had not tested positive in. When Coleman returned and they began sharing start lines regularly, the 60-metre indoor circuit, the Diamond League outdoor meets, the national championships that force American sprinters to compete against each other for limited spots, Bromell represented something that the race results alone could not fully capture. He had occupied the space during the vacancy, had received the story that the suspension had temporarily redirected, and the specific hatred of watching someone else carry a narrative you had been building toward since before the injuries and suspensions had taken turns removing both of them from the conversation is a hatred that runs deeper than the times on the scoreboard. Coleman said what Bromell gave him was the hatred of a man who had stepped into a room he had been locked out of and arranged the furniture. Every race they shared was a rearrangement argument, and the argument never fully resolved in the way a decisive result would have resolved it. Number 3. Fred Kerley, the teammate who matched his personal best during the suspension and never let him forget it. Fred Kerley ran 9.76 seconds at the 2022 US Track and Field Championships, matching Coleman's personal best, the time that had defined Coleman's position in the all-time rankings as the 6th fastest man in history. The time that the suspension had prevented him from defending and improving. When Coleman returned from the ban, he found a teammate who had arrived at the same number and was building from it toward the 2022 World Championship title that Coleman had arrived back from suspension, specifically planning to reclaim. Kerley won that World Championship in Oregon. Coleman finished the season ranked 8th in the world with a best of 9.87. The defending champion returned to the event he had won and found that the number that had made him the defending champion, 9.76, now had another American's name beside it in the record books, and that the man whose name was there had won the title in the same season. Their head-to-head record told the story of a rivalry that neither of them had resolved cleanly by the time the Paris Olympic year arrived. Kerley led 3-1 before the 2023 season. Then Coleman beat him at the Xiamen Diamond League in 9.83 seconds. They split the 2024 early season meetings in China. And then the US Olympic trials arrived, with both of them needing a top 3 finish. Coleman ran 9.93 seconds and finished 4th. Kerley ran 9.88 and made the team. Coleman said what Kerley gave him was the hatred of a rival who matched his ceiling during his absence and treated the match as a starting point rather than an arrival. Most athletes who reach a personal best of 9.76 treat it as the confirmation of what they are. Kerley treated it as the floor from which the next argument would be made, and the specific hatred of watching a rival use your best number as his baseline during the period when you were not present to defend it is a hatred that the subsequent head-to-head results could narrow but never fully close. Number 2, Marcell Jacobs, the Italian who beat him by 0.003 of a second and owned the title that mattered most. Marcell Jacobs of Italy beat Christian Coleman at the 2022 World Athletics Indoor Championships, 60-metre final in Belgrade by 0.003 of a second. Both men were credited with 6.41 seconds. The scoreboard took 80 extra seconds to resolve the result. And when the name appeared, Jacobs, not Coleman, it confirmed something that the Tokyo Olympic gold medal had established and the indoor season had been building toward, that the man Coleman needed to settle his most significant unfinished business with was not an American. Coleman held the 60-metre world record at 6.34 seconds. He had been the dominant force in the indoor sprint for years before the suspension interrupted everything. The World Indoor Championships title was his to defend. And Jacobs, the man who had won the Olympic 100-metre gold in Tokyo while Coleman was serving his ban, the gold that Coleman had been identified as the favourite for before the suspension removed him from consideration, had arrived at Belgrade to take the indoor title as well. Coleman had been publicly tracking Jacobs all indoor season. He had said it directly before the race. "I see him." The two words communicated exactly what they were meant to communicate: that Jacobs's undefeated indoor season had been noted, that Belgrade was the place the observation would produce an answer. And then Jacobs crossed the line 0.003 ahead, and the answer that Belgrade produced was not the one Coleman had been preparing. Coleman said afterward he had not seen Jacobs coming because they were in separate lanes, that he had felt Marvin Bracey more than Jacobs through the race, that he genuinely did not know who had won when they crossed the line together. What Coleman did not say, what the 0.003 of a second communicated without requiring words, was that Jacobs had now beaten him to two titles that the 2019 version of Coleman had been positioned to win. The Olympic gold taken while he was suspended. The world indoor title taken by a margin smaller than the gap a heartbeat produces. Two results, both carrying the same name, neither one available for revision. Coleman said what Jacobs gave him was the hatred of an opponent whose presence in the historical record came entirely at his expense. Every title Jacobs held was a title that existed in the space the suspension had opened. The Olympic gold. The world indoor title decided by 0.003, two pieces of evidence that the sport had distributed its most significant honours during the period when Coleman was not present to contest them, and that the one opportunity for a genuine reckoning had ended with a scoreboard that took 80 seconds to resolve, and then showed the wrong name. Number 1. Noah Lyles. The man who called himself the king of a house Coleman had built, and made the claim, "Stick in public." Noah Lyles and Christian Coleman have shared the American sprint landscape for years in the specific way that two men who occupy the same national program, compete for the same limited spots at the same national championships, and carry the same flag to the same global stages share a landscape, which is to say, not comfortably, and not with the mutual generosity that the shared flag might suggest. Their rivalry in the 60 metres became the defining American indoor sprint story across multiple seasons. Coleman won the 2024 World Indoor Championships 60-metre gold in Glasgow in 6.41 seconds, defeating Lyles, who ran 6.44. Lyles struck back at the USATF Indoor Championships, running a personal best of 6.43 seconds to hand Coleman one of his rare losses in the event. Then Lyles won the New Balance Indoor Grand Prix and posted the photograph. "My house." Two words directed at the sport and at Bromell in particular, but carrying a subtext that Coleman, who held the world record in the event, understood as clearly as anyone. Coleman had said it on the Netflix Sprint docuseries with the specific restraint of a man who keeps his competitive feelings internal by design. "I've been knowing Noah Lyles because we have competed over the years, but honestly, I try not to buy or feed into other people's antics. It's just not me. I'm not that type of guy." The statement communicated everything it was intended to communicate, and the opposite of everything it appeared to concede. Coleman's refusal to engage with Lyles's public approach to their rivalry was not distance. It was the specific discipline of a man who had decided the only arena where the argument between them needed to be settled was the track. Not Instagram, not podcasts, not docu-series confessionals. The track. But the track kept producing results that the rivalry's public dimension was making harder to present as settled. Lyles won the Olympic 100-metre gold in Paris. Coleman did not make the Olympic final. and the year that was supposed to produce the outdoor reckoning to match their indoor battles had ended with Lyles standing on the Olympic podium and Coleman watching the race from outside it. Coleman said what Lyles gave him was the hatred that produced the most complicated feelings of the five, not because Lyles had consistently beaten him. The indoor record between them was genuinely contested, and the outdoor results had been close enough to make dominance an impossible description. But because of how Lyles framed the competition, the public declarations, the social media posts, the docuseries moments, Lyles conducted their rivalry in every available arena simultaneously, and the specific hatred of a man who treats the competition between you as a performance designed for an audience, while you are trying to treat it as an argument to be settled between two people and a finish line, is a hatred that no single result ever fully resolves. Lyles had called it his house, had won the Olympic gold in the race that mattered most, and the record books would carry both of those facts exactly as they happened. Coleman said it was the rivalry that stayed longest, not because Lyles was clearly superior, because he had made sure the world was always watching when he was not. At 30, Christian Coleman had not finished. The world record still stood at 6:34 seconds. The 2019 World Championship gold still sat in the historical record as evidence of what he had been capable of before the suspension rearranged the timeline. The career that had announced itself in London as the most technically gifted sprint talent the United States had produced in years was still producing arguments that the results had not yet permanently resolved. What he had, at 30, was honesty. 5 runners, 5 different versions of the same hatred. Justin Gatlin gave him the hatred of a context he did not choose. Trayvon Bromell gave him the hatred of a man who had arranged the furniture during his absence. Fred Kerley gave him the hatred of a rival who used his ceiling as a baseline. Marcell Jacobs gave him the hatred of a man whose presence in the record books came entirely at his expense. And Noah Lyles gave him the hatred that produced the most complicated feelings. The man who made the competition a performance and then won the performance that mattered most. The world saw the starts, the world record, the technical mastery that coaches pointed to as a model for how the event's opening phase should be run. What the world did not always see was the 5 names that made the mastery necessary. At 30, he finally said them out loud,